TDK has moved to the STK as a free agent. No one should be shocked or surprised at this being one of the first moves that went down during the 2025 free agency and trade period. And every single player that moves during this window, we will review them, what it means for the club they've landed at, the club they've departed, and then wrap it all up together for you with a reflection on the fantasy footy implications for AFL Fantasy SuperCoach and your keeper leagues for 2026 and beyond. Let's look back at this year that he just dished up from a fantasy football perspective for us. That's really what you're coming to the coaches panel for. Mid-80s average in AFL Fantasy, mid to high 90s average in SuperCoach, but really you could break the season down into two clumps, and two core things really took place in the middle junction of the year that ultimately defined a lot. Over the first 9 games of the year in AFL Fantasy, average is 97, 5 tons, 2 over 120. SuperCoach, average much higher, 113.7, 8 tons, 3 of those were a 133 or above. So really showcased that ceiling. But it was actually over the final 3 months of the year that scoring took a dip. I'm talking about a 76 in fantasy and an 85.7 in SuperCoach. Politely, that's got a couple of tons in rounds 13 and 14 for both those two formats. So we could really make it look worse for Tom if we wanted to. The last 10, 68.6 in fantasy and up at about 76 in SuperCoach. So we could really make it look bad, but context matters. It totally matters. And 2 things happened in this middle junction of the season that really shortcut why he had such a hot start and a crummy finish to the year. 2 things happened. Number 1, copped a really decent injury throat issue that, alluding from a lot of media reports and just kind of reading between the lines, he never really got a hold of that beyond that. It never really quite got that full kind of oxygen back in the tank, for sake of a better phrase. And so he just couldn't be athletically at his best. So number 1, that happened and was impacting him right through the back 3 months or 10 weeks of the season. The other thing that happened coinciding with that is both Mackay and Curnow out of the side for a big chunk of this back half of the year. And so Tom no longer becomes the alpha A1 ruck first and then occasionally sits back on the bench or deep forward to rest, and others like a Mackay jump into the ruck. But rather, Pitternet comes in, and Pitternet's not a bad ruckman. He's not great, but he's definitely not as good forward as what Tom de Koning was. So Voss, limited options with your best 2 key forwards out, has to throw TDK into that forward spot first and limiting the ruck option. Again, alongside this undercurrent, everybody knew Tom was going, you can't be offering 75 million and not then be changing the narrative of where you're going, especially when those clubs feel at least in the same echo chamber of where they're going to be on the ladder. So this is the context of the year, because you look at that front half of the year from a fantasy perspective and go, that's awesome. And then the back part of the year, you're like, well, that's rubbish. But everything's got a narrative behind it. And to me, I can pretty comfortably get behind not dismissing, but diminishing how chaotic those final 10 weeks of the year were. Again, we're talking high 60s in fantasy, mid 70s in SuperCoach. I think he's closer to the front end of the year than what he is the back end of the year. But it all depends on a couple of things. And so what does it mean for the Saints? Well, I believe what they've done here with the recruitment of a Tom de Koning is not only get themselves a younger version of Rowan Marshall, but also pick purchase along the way through using the salary cap. Tom adds that younger version of Rowan, very athletic, very mobile around how he gets around the ground. He's really strong beneath his knees. Now, adds something dynamic that is a little different to Rowan. They're not the same, but they're comparable in a bunch of different areas. So they go and get him with salary cap, and I fully expect Rowan to depart the club, head to a Geelong-like place, get a first-round pick for it. Bang, all of a sudden you've used the salary cap you've got to use, and you're being able to pick purchase through your salary cap a younger player. So that's where I think from a St Kilda perspective, this kind of works. You've got the money, you might as well use it. And you can get someone else through the draft alongside it, whether or not you trade that asset or something else. They're going to be busy, and I'm going to be talking about the Saints a lot in this trade and free agency video series. But I think for St Kilda, this works beautifully for them, especially if Rowan's out the door. You've got a mobile, young, athletic ruckman, adds a few dynamics, adds something different to their forward line when he needs to go and rest forward. They've got some really nice young assets if they can keep them fit and healthy. I actually really, really like this move for St Kilda. Well, for the Blues, they're looking to go and land and have already got Liam Reedy, who's said he wants to join the club from Fremantle. I think that's a nice, cheap option. And Pitternet is more than serviceable in the ruck. He's not your future. That's what Reedy's for. I think if they can develop Reedy nicely, showed some really good craft in the waffle, I actually think this works out pretty nicely for Carlton, given where their list profile sits right now. Get some decent money off their books, can restock for the future, get a decent compo pick, and also land, I think, a pretty talented young ruckman to learn a little bit more of the craft under Pitternet. I think this works out for both parties really, really well. What does this mean for us from a fantasy footy perspective in 2026? Well, I think a lot of variables have landed our way. Now, the big premise here is Rowan Marshall's out the door. If he's not, I have zero interest at all in TDK. Zero. I just don't see how he and Rowan Marshall work well together. I feel like they stump each other's growth and development from a fantasy perspective. And so if they are still in the same team by the end of the trade period, I am washing my hands of both players for 2026, barring injuries landing and impacting one of them. They're two similar vein of ruckman. They need to be in and around the ball. They're really larger midfielders to a lesser phraseology. I just don't want any shape of them if they are together. However, if TDK is on his own, this is awesome because we have seen this St Kilda ecosystem and the way they hold, retain, and move the ball under Ross line be so favourable to players that are around that ball space. And I've already talked about that kind of front half, back half of the year from Tom. To put it into price perspective, he's about 2 to 3 points per game cheaper than what he started the 2025 season at. And the pathway of scoring is really clear and simple. Again, we're talking high 90s over that first 9 weeks of the year in fantasy and 110 plus over that same period of time in SuperCoach. That is an awesome return of sort of like 15 points per game of value and is a great R2 if you want to go up and get yourself a Cherry, a Gorn, whomever you like, Grundy at R1, or you can chuck him in at R1 and really go for a bit of a value combination in your ruck spot. I think both can work. So if you were bullish on Tom sort of February, March 2025, you should be, on the premise Rowan Marshall is out, equally as excited about what TDK and he could deliver for you in your fantasy footy side this coming season. For me, I love TDK in. If Romar's out, I am really interested in what he could do and absolutely is a viable starting squad option and should return some decent trade value for you if you're looking to move him off in a keeper league or you want to go draft him on the keeper platform in 2025 into 2026. I really, really like him as a pick. But what do you think? Is TDK on the radar? Does it depend on Romar or it doesn't matter? You've already made your decision. Why don't you comment and let me know? I'd be keen to know your thoughts. Every single player that moves clubs this free agency and trade period, we'll be dropping a video and an audio podcast letting you know our thoughts and reflections on these players. But tell us what you think. We appreciate you stopping by. Make sure you like the channel. Make sure you get in touch with us. We'll be dropping these all throughout the trade and free agency period.